Hello Driving Intelligence. For me, and maybe many of you, I like to update, modify my vehicles, make some adjustments or changes that brings that vehicle to the 21st century instead of going out and spending $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 on a new vehicle. So I'm constantly updating my truck. One of the things I did to bring a new look to it was to swap my gauge cluster at the F150 with the Navigator gauge cluster. And as long as you have the speedometer goes from 0 to 100 miles per hour, it's a plug and play change. So to do this, you have to disassemble your dash. I'm not going to go into the details of that. But what I want to talk about is making sure that the gauge cluster will work and that you are aware of the PAT system, the passive anti-theft system that needs to be transferred from your existing gauge cluster to the Navigator gauge cluster. And it's relatively simple to do. There's a series of screws on the back of this that I've already taken out, which allows you to remove this cover. Behind here is the circuit board that you'll need to transfer to the Navigator gauge cluster. There's only one thing you need to do on this. There's a little electrical bus that needs to be gently pulled open, and it'll give you access to these pins. And now you can pull this circuit board off. This is what's got to be transferred over to the Navigator cluster. At that point, this gives you access to all the gauges, the working side of the gauges. So a couple things I wanted to point out also that I had to deal with. I pulled my Navigator gauge cluster from a pick and pull junkyard. And when I first hooked it up, I wasn't getting good speedometer reading and I wasn't getting good tach reading. It wasn't accurate. I'm going to go over that in a second in the video. But one of the things I did, I took this back off and I sprayed CRC cleaner in each of these little holes. I'll show that in some snapshots also. To try to clean up some of the electronics inside these gauges. That did help me. So you might want to have to do that. You might do that just as a preparatory activity before you put the gauge cluster in your vehicle. Another thing that I had to do, even though it still wasn't matching up, the speed and the tach, I had to pull these pins off of the gauges. And I'll show in a second how I did the speedometer. But both of them actually, I had separate monitors. I had a separate tach monitor, and I also was using a GPS signal, as I mentioned. I'll show you. And it's real easy to reestablish the accuracy of these gauges. Another thing I want to talk about is while you've got this in pieces, what you want to do, one of the biggest problems that I hear about with these vehicles is that the odometer fails on these digital odometers. And there's a series of little soldered connections on the back of this circuit board. If I were you, while you had this all apart, I would go ahead and add a little solder to each one of these connections and make sure they're solid, especially since you're pulling the bus off and you're going to probably loosen up these solder connections. Apparently from the factory, a lot of these solder connections weren't significant enough to maintain connection. So I highly recommend you throw a little solder, being careful not to short out one pin to the other. Then it's a simple matter of reassembling this. What I want to make sure also is that if you have to adjust your gauge and tach, when you put this assembly back on, you don't have to have the clear part of this assembly on. You can take this off, clean it really good. Leave it off while you're making sure that the pins are adjusted properly. And that's it. So let me know if you have any questions in the comment section below. And I'd love for you to subscribe, hit that like button, and I'd love to hear more from you on Driving Intelligence. I've got a GPS monitor here. I've got the clear part of the gauge display taken off, and I pulled the needle off
use the GPS to get the speed as close as possible at 50, the thing I notice is that the weight of the needle will actually pull the needle down from your set point. So I did 50 since it's straight up and down. Hope that makes sense to everybody. Abe and I would like you to subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and provide comments below. See you next time on Driving Intelligence.